Hello there. This one is called trauma bonding. A year ago I don't think I'd even heard the term, but it's become in very frequent use these days. So trauma bonding is when two or more people go through something traumatic, something really distressing, upsetting, life-threatening, all the rest of it, and if they survive that experience, it creates a bond which is very strong, very difficult to break, in fact. And what can happen to people is that this can become a habit, and it can become such an entrenched habit. It can be a very difficult one to let go of. So you get the classic situation: someone in a relationship and their partner is violent, and people that know them and love them say, just leave, get out, end it. And it's so very sad, because those people who exhort that course of action are merely revealing that they have no understanding of what trauma bonding is about. A particularly extreme form of this is Stockholm Syndrome, and that took place in a hostage situation in a bank in Stockholm, and the bank employees who were the hostages, eventually, because they were there for long enough, they became far more identified with the bank robbers than they did with the police, whose job it was supposedly to rescue them. So it's a big thing, trauma bonding, and I've had occasion to give it a lot of consideration lately, because what's become so clear to me is the more consideration I've given it, the more I realise the more people I'm aware of are actually experiencing this. And so I thought it was time to make a film about it. So if a person suffers from trauma bonding, the most obvious question to ask is, what is the root cause? Where does this come from? How did this situation arise in the first place? And of course, it's no surprise to realise that the origin of this particular constellation of circumstances goes back to childhood, just like so many other things. So when children experience severe and extreme trauma, and if they survive it, the ones that they are with are the ones that they bond to. So in certain situations, if there's a whole bunch of children being abused, say by a teacher, then that can bring about a real strong kinship and affinity with them, especially if it's not a day school but a boarding school, where the whole thing becomes more intensified because it's 24/7. So that is one thing to say about trauma bonding, but I want to talk about something else, which is that what you've got going on in that situation is you've got a person who's taking on the role of the victim, and the child is generally going to be in that role, although not always. And then there's another role, and the first word that seemed to be appropriate was the word abuser, but after a lot of consideration I realise that in many occasions there is a word that's more appropriate, and the word is punisher. That's a person who actually inflicts the abuse, inflicts the trauma. Because now I'm not talking about a situation with a group of people being threatened in a bank robbery hostage situation. I'm talking about a domestic situation here. So you've got the victim who is suffering, you've got the punisher who's creating the suffering. And for a while, as I was contemplating and meditating about this, that's what I was aware of, but then it really hit me. There's a third role in all this, and so the best place I can go is to talk about my own life rather than talking about anybody else's. So when I was growing up, what used to happen is, so I'll explain, I'm talking about under the age of 11, so young child. So my brother was 2 years younger than me, and brothers, as they often do, they tend to fight. So what would happen is at the end of the working day, my father would come home and my mother would read out the list of charges. Whatever we'd done that was wrong, she would basically stand there and tell him about all our wrongdoings. And then he would take one of us, one at a time, into another room and inflict punishment on us, corporal punishment, hitting. So that made me realise there are three roles in this. There's victim, punisher, and accuser. It can be accuser. There's another way this can come up, whereby you can get a situation that a woman will watch or witness her partner abusing one or more of the children, and this can be sexual abuse, this can be violence. So there is this third role. There could be an accuser, there could be a witness, or there could be a co-conspirator. But the important thing to realise here is that there's this possibility of a third option, whereby the person is not actually doing any of the punishing themselves, but they are supporting and facilitating and making it all possible. So it's a pretty sickening thing to have to contemplate. But what I've become increasingly aware of is how it's such a common thing, it's ubiquitous. It really is such a common pattern that we have in our society, and that's not at all surprising when we consider the fact that effectively, if you want to take this into the bigger picture of the cultural situation, what we've got what people would have called once upon a time the working class, and they take on the roles of the victim, and you've got the oppressive elite that are feeding off their labour, whether it's through excessive taxation or simple extortion, whatever it may be. So that's like a punisher in the financial and economic situation. And then we have people that take on the roles of the witness or the accuser, and there may be professionals that just allow this situation to continue without doing anything about it. So it is a big subject, isn't it? So this is not just about individual domestic situations. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sit down and I'm going to share with you what came up for me last night as I was pursuing this in a lot of detail. So here's the first thing. First thing to realise is that the abuser is actually more lost than the victim. So these are my insights. I'm very interested to hear yours, but this is my considered opinion after giving a lot of thought, looking at my own life, looking at my past, looking about the lives of people I know who are experiencing this in the present time. The abuser is more lost than the victim. That's a puzzling thing to say. And I've got a corollary from that, which is, if this is the case, that's my hypothesis, it means that the victim has got the leverage. And if the victim has the leverage, it means that they have the potential to put a stop to it, to break the cycle of violence. Now, it's a really big however, because my assertion is this: the victim cannot put a stop to it until they're ready, until they've suffered enough. And we do quite often have situations where we're aware of someone who's almost ready to break the chains of this cycle, of this unholy triangle. And when they're almost ready, they may reach out for help. And if help is offered at that time, no result will be the result. No dice. They stay in the situation. When they are ready and they reach out, that's when transformation is possible. And before the end of this film, I'm going to suggest something which is very worth considering in this situation. But let's just take it a little bit further. If we go into deep root causes, origins, in terms of the shamanic perspective and the spiritual perspective, this is what I can see. The role of the abuser, the punisher, is to push and push and push the victim until they finally reach the point where they stand up to the abuse and they stop it. So what I'm arguing is what we've got going on here effectively is a soul contract. So before these souls were incarnated into physical beings, they would have had an opportunity to make contracts. And if a person had always been a doormat, always walked over in previous lives, then a possibility, an option to actually address this once and for all is to have a really abusive situation, which is, it's either you live or die. When it gets like that, that can be enough to cause a person to do the thing which I have spoken about many times. As I've said before, when worms turn, universes rearrange themselves. When a victim stands up and takes their own personal power, it's quite extraordinary what happens at that time. So the point I'm making is that the punisher is ultimately weaker than the victim. The punisher is the weak one, the victim's the strong one, and this is why to wait for the punisher to change is much less likely to bring helpful results than for the victim to change, because they are fundamentally stronger, because they can actually deal with this shit. Whereas often a punisher exposed to any kind of shock, trauma, violence, they're just lost, have no staying power whatsoever. So let's go right into the heart of it all in terms of childhood and being a child. There's something that all children need. They need attention, and their first choice is always to solicit and receive loving attention. Of course it is. Only what happens when the child reaches the point that it realizes that's not going to happen? There is no love for me in my situation, in my family, in my culture, in my society, in the world, whatever it may be. When the child has finally realized that there ain't no love for me, then the second option is to choose the option of soliciting attention to receive punishment and suffering. And this is so much better than the third option, and this is something that is well known by the whole psychotherapeutic community. The worst option of all is being ignored, which is why it is argued that the neglect is actually even worse than abuse. No matter how bad the abuse, at least the person is getting some attention, no matter how damaging it may be. But to receive nothing, no attention whatsoever, that's the worst. And indeed some horrific experiments were done by scientists. In the 20th century they took babies, and they got newborn babies, and they put them into an environment with no human beings, no attention whatsoever, and they made sure that they had like mechanical devices to feed them and all this. But they wanted to find out what would happen, excuse me, but the morons, they wanted to find out what would happen if a baby was completely excluded of all human contact. Well, they died. Huge surprise, they all died. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Bit of a no-brainer really, isn't it? So what I'm saying is, when a child grows up, what they tend to do is they tend to seek out and receive the kind of attention they were used to in childhood. Whatever they were habituated to receive is what they tend to go for. And I particularly remember a woman telling me about her son, and he was a young lad, and he's got loads of bald patches on his head, and it was because that was him showing the stress of the violence in the home. And basically what the woman was explaining is that she's got a lovely husband and lovely children, and she's just a monster. She's just having a go, shouting, screaming, creating dramas, and being a really horrific mother. And she was completely powerless to stop herself from being like this, because that is what she experienced when she was a little child growing up. So she was not able to do the leap out of the old behaviour patterns into what ideally she wants to do. She desperately wanted to be a loving mother. She wanted to be kind and wonderful with her children, and to give her husband all that he deserved in terms of love. She simply wasn't able to do it. So that is a really harsh thing to be aware of. Something else I want to add is that when narcissists are involved in this unholy triangle of accuser, punisher and victim, if they're taking on the role of the punishing, and if they're taking on the role of the accusing or the witnessing, they are actually feeding off the energy of the victim suffering. And I only read in a book just a week ago about this couple that had been married for years, and the person knew them very well. She says the extraordinary thing about this couple is whenever one of them had any misfortune, any suffering at all, the other one was full of glee and delight and full of the joys of life, because the other one was suffering. And when I read those words just over a week ago, I thought, why? I couldn't understand it, but it all came to me last night. It's because they feed off the energy of the suffering. So literally that suffering of that victim is nourishment to narcissists. So you can see that narcissists are going to play a pretty big role in this unholy triangle. If ever an empath is caught up in any of this stuff, they tend to do quite the opposite. They tend to suffer with the victim because they're experiencing the authenticity of the situation. There's no profit in it for them at all. So, in my own experience, having had a chance to look back, I've seen how all this has played out. So I want to use a metaphor to describe the situation we're in terms of healing or resolving this situation, resolving the problem. So this is the way that I see it. Interested to hear your take on this, but this is my understanding where I'm at the moment. You have a situation where the person is deeply trauma bonded. What they keep on doing is they keep on recreating circumstances which you can allow more of the trauma. So my metaphor for this is, think of an old-fashioned record. Yeah, an old-fashioned record that you played on a record player. It's full of grooves, isn't it? It is. So from the point of view of a person who's suffering from trauma bonding, it is as if their life is a field that's been ploughed full of grooves, and each of these grooves is quite deep. And so basically what they do, they stumble along, and the next thing you know, they're in another groove, and they pick themselves up, dust themselves off, drag themselves out of that groove, take a few more steps, and they're back in another groove. They keep on getting caught in the same pattern because of the way that their brain has been wired. So people's brains are wired, and it's got a lot to do with our experiences. And the more we have a repetitive experience, the stronger that groove is, the stronger those set of nerves, cells firing in the same old way. So what would be really beneficial for a person who's suffering from trauma bonding would be to have something that would enable them to create some new neural connections. And it's our old friends the fungi that's responsible here. So we can talk about the non-psychoactive lion's mane, cordyceps, chaga, reishi. There are so many wonderful mushrooms out there, and these catalyze the rewiring of the brain. It literally, the mushrooms allow new neural pathways to be created and developed and laid down. And I would also like to mention the psilocybin mushroom. Now, what's been happening in the last recent period of time is more and more interest is being shown in the psilocybin mushroom, because, and there's no question about it, brain scans have proved it. You can do a brain scan of a person before taking the mushroom and one during the experience, and you'll see completely different neural pathways that have been created by doing this. Very powerful way to work. So my suggestion is, if a person is suffering from deep trauma bonding, one of the things that would be really worth doing would be to investigate methods which will enable them to create some new neural pathways, lay down some new possibilities for themselves. And that's certainly an avenue worth contemplating. And if you do decide to go down that road, it's really important to do that work with a person that is going to be your carer, holding the space. It's not something you want to be doing unsupported. You need to have someone to support you doing this work. It's very important. So any methods at all that you can come across in your researches which will enable you to create and maintain new neural links, new neural pathways, and to be able to allow the old ones to fade away. That's what's really going to make a difference in the very perplexing subject of trauma bonding. Please let me know any opinions you have on this subject. It's something that I find fascinating, because I'm surrounded by people who have these experiences. All the love to you.